What if a single letter could change everything you thought you knew about your family? In the quiet halls of a hospital, Nurse Clara Stevens stumbles upon a letter clutched in a comatose patient's hand. Inside, a shocking revelation: the patient claims to be her grandfather, a man she never knew existed. The hospital was quiet, the hum of machines a constant background noise as the night shift wore on. Nurse Clara Stevens moved through the dimly lit corridors, her white sneakers barely making a sound on the polished floors. It was the end of a long shift, and Clara was looking forward to getting home, maybe catching a few hours of sleep before her next rotation. But as she passed room 412, something caught her eye. Mr. Wainwright, a long-term patient in a coma, lay still as ever. His frail form seemed to sink into the bed, his face a picture of peacefulness. Clara had grown used to seeing him like this, a fixture in the ward for the past several months. But today, something was different. In his right hand, usually limp and lifeless, he held a crumpled piece of paper. Clara hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, curiosity piqued. "Strange," she muttered to herself. Patients in Mr. Wainwright's condition rarely moved, let alone held objects. Gently, she pried the paper from his fingers, being careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment surrounding him. As the paper unfolded, Clara's breath hitched. Her name, written in shaky but unmistakable handwriting, stared back at her from the front of a small, sealed envelope. She stood there, the letter in her hands, caught between duty and curiosity. Clara knew she should probably hand it over to the authorities or Mr. Wainwright's next of kin, but something in her gut told her this was meant for her. The night shift had left the ward eerily silent, and for a moment, Clara felt utterly alone, as if the entire world had paused, waiting for her to decide. With a quick glance around to ensure no one was watching, Clara slipped the envelope into her pocket. The decision felt both momentous and trivial at the same time, like a pebble thrown into a still pond, ripples slowly spreading outward. She finished her rounds in a daze, her mind already racing with questions. As soon as her shift ended, Clara hurried to her small apartment a few blocks away. The walk was a blur, the familiar streets and buildings passing by unnoticed. Once inside, she sat down at her kitchen table, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. The envelope felt oddly heavy, as if it carried more than just a piece of paper. Clara took a deep breath, her fingers shaking as she tore open the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. As she unfolded it, Clara's eyes scanned the words, and with each line, her heart beat faster. "Dear Clara," it began. "I hope this letter finds you. My name is Albert Wainwright, and if you're reading this, it means I am likely still in a coma, or perhaps worse. There is something I must tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago. You see, I am your grandfather." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her grandfather? She had no memory of ever meeting anyone by that name. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile this revelation with her understanding of her family. Her parents had died when she was very young, and she had been raised by her aunt and uncle. They had never mentioned a grandfather named Albert. She continued reading, the letter detailing a story that felt both surreal and strangely familiar. Mr. Wainwright wrote about her parents, describing them in a way that resonated with the few fragmented memories she had. He spoke of a tragic accident that had taken their lives and how, in the aftermath, he had been unable to care for her. The decision to give her up for adoption had been one of the hardest things he had ever done, but he believed it was the best for her. Clara sat back, the letter slipping from her fingers onto the table. A torrent of emotions washed over her: shock, confusion, anger, and an unexpected wave of sadness. The man she had cared for as a nurse, without knowing their connection, had been lying just a few rooms away all this time. How could this be true? And why had he waited until now to tell her? The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. Clara stood up, pacing around her tiny kitchen, her mind racing. She knew she needed to verify this information, but where would she even start? Her aunt and uncle were her only links to the past, but she doubted they knew much about Mr. Wainwright. They had always been evasive about her parents, sharing only vague details when she asked. Clara's eyes fell on the clock. It was nearly 8 a.m., she had been up all night and needed to rest, but sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. She grabbed her phone, scrolling through contacts, looking for someone she could talk to about this. But who? This was so personal, so raw. She wasn't ready to share it with anyone yet. Her thoughts drifted back to the hospital, to Mr. Wainwright lying silently in his bed. How many times had she walked past him without knowing? The letter seemed to pulse with a life of its own, an unspoken plea from a man unable to speak. Clara felt a strange mix of responsibility and urgency. She needed to learn more, not just for herself, but for him, too. He had reached out in the only way he could, and now it was up to her to piece together the story. Finally, she sat down again, picking up the letter. The last lines caught her attention. "I know this must be a shock, and I am sorry for that. But I had to try and reach out to you. Please, if you can find it in your heart, come visit me. There's so much more to say, and I want to see you, even if just once, before it's too late." Clara folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope. She stared at it for a long time, her mind swirling with questions and uncertainties. What was she supposed to do now? Visit him? Ignore it? Her life had been upended in the span of a single night, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face what came next. As she pondered, the morning light began to creep through the kitchen window, casting a soft glow over the room. The day was just beginning, but for Clara, it felt like an ending, or perhaps a new beginning. She wasn't sure which yet. All she knew was that she had to find out more, no matter where the answers led her. The past had reached out to her, and she couldn't ignore its call. Clara stood up, the letter in her hand, and walked to the window. The city outside was waking up, cars starting to fill the streets, people beginning their day. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. There was a journey ahead, one she hadn't anticipated, but one she felt compelled to undertake. As she looked out at the world, Clara made a silent vow to uncover the truth, to understand her past, and to meet the man who claimed to be her grandfather. And with that resolve, she felt a new sense of purpose. The letter had opened a door to a past she hadn't known existed, and now it was time to step through it, into the unknown. Clara turned away from the window, her decision made. The next steps might be uncertain, but she knew she had to take them. For herself, for her family, and for the man lying in that hospital room, waiting for her to discover the truth. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the city as Clara Stevens walked through the hospital doors. The letter from Mr. Wainwright had weighed heavily on her mind all night, leaving her restless and filled with questions. As she made her way to his room, she couldn't shake the surreal feeling that her life had been irrevocably altered by a few words on a piece of paper. She paused outside room 412, gathering her thoughts. Inside, Mr. Wainwright lay still, the steady beat of the heart monitor the only indication of life. Clara took a deep breath and entered, closing the door quietly behind her. She stood by his bedside, looking down at the man who claimed to be her grandfather. His face was peaceful, almost serene, and Clara wondered what he was dreaming about, if anything at all. "Mr. Wainwright," she began softly, feeling a bit foolish talking to someone who couldn't respond. "Albert. I got your letter." There was no reaction, just the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. Clara pulled up a chair and sat down, placing the letter on her lap. And why had he waited until now to tell her? The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. Clara stood up, pacing around her tiny kitchen, her mind racing. She knew she needed to verify this information, but where would she even start? Her aunt and uncle were her only links to the past, but she doubted they knew much about Mr. Wainwright. They had always been evasive about her parents, sharing only vague details when she asked. Clara's eyes fell on the clock. It was nearly 8 a.m., she had been up all night and needed to rest, but sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. She grabbed her phone, scrolling through contacts, looking for someone she could talk to about this. But who? This was so personal, so raw. She wasn't ready to share it with anyone yet. Her thoughts drifted back to the hospital, to Mr. Wainwright lying silently in his bed. How many times had she walked past him without knowing? The letter seemed to pulse with a life of its own, an unspoken plea from a man unable to speak. Clara felt a strange mix of responsibility and urgency. She needed to learn more, not just for herself, but for him, too. He had reached out in the only way he could, and now it was up to her to piece together the story. Finally, she sat down again, picking up the letter. The last lines caught her attention. "I know this must be a shock, and I am sorry for that. But I had to try and reach out to you. Please, if you can find it in your heart, come visit me. There's so much more to say, and I want to see you, even if just once, before it's too late." Clara folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope. She stared at it for a long time, her mind swirling with questions and uncertainties. What was she supposed to do now? Visit him? Ignore it? Her life had been upended in the span of a single night, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face what came next. As she pondered, the morning light began to creep through the kitchen window, casting a soft glow over the room. The day was just beginning, but for Clara, it felt like an ending, or perhaps a new beginning. She wasn't sure which yet. All she knew was that she had to find out more, no matter where the answers led her. The past had reached out to her, and she couldn't ignore its call. Clara stood up, the letter in her hand, and walked to the window. The city outside was waking up, cars starting to fill the streets, people beginning their day. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. There was a journey ahead, one she hadn't anticipated, but one she felt compelled to undertake. As she looked out at the world, Clara made a silent vow to uncover the truth, to understand her past, and to meet the man who claimed to be her grandfather. And with that resolve, she felt a new sense of purpose. The letter had opened a door to a past she hadn't known existed, and now it was time to step through it, into the unknown. Clara turned away from the window, her decision made. The next steps might be uncertain, but she knew she had to take them. For herself, for her family, and for the man lying in that hospital room, waiting for her to discover the truth. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the city as Clara Stevens walked through the hospital doors. The letter from Mr. Wainwright had weighed heavily on her mind all night, leaving her restless and filled with questions. As she made her way to his room, she couldn't shake the surreal feeling that her life had been irrevocably altered by a few words on a piece of paper. She paused outside room 412, gathering her thoughts. Inside, Mr. Wainwright lay still, the steady beat of the heart monitor the only indication of life. Clara took a deep breath and entered, closing the door quietly behind her. She stood by his bedside, looking down at the man who claimed to be her grandfather. His face was peaceful, almost serene, and Clara wondered what he was dreaming about, if anything at all. "Mr. Wainwright," she began softly, feeling a bit foolish talking to someone who couldn't respond. "Albert. I got your letter." There was no reaction, just the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. Clara pulled up a chair and sat down, placing the letter on her lap. She felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if she had been here before, in another life. The silence in the room was thick, almost oppressive. "I don't know what to think," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't even know you existed. My aunt and uncle never mentioned you. They barely talked about my parents." As she spoke, Clara felt a knot in her stomach tighten. Her parents had always been a distant, almost mythical presence in her life, their faces blurry in her memories. She remembered snippets of laughter, the scent of her mother's perfume, the warmth of her father's embrace. But beyond those fleeting impressions, there was nothing. No stories, no photographs, just a void that her aunt and uncle had filled with silence. Clara looked at Mr. Wainwright, trying to see some resemblance, some connection. He looked so different from the vague images she had of her parents. She sighed and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The room felt like a cocoon, insulating her from the outside world. "I guess I'm here because I want answers," she said, more to herself than to him. But I don't even know where to start. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts. She stopped at her aunt's number, her finger hovering over the call button. They hadn't spoken in months. Their relationship had always been strained, especially since Clara had decided to become a nurse instead of following the more traditional path her family had hoped for. With a resigned sigh, she dialed the number. The phone rang a few times before her aunt's familiar voice answered, tinged with surprise. "Clara? It's been a while. How are you?" "Hi, Aunt Margaret," Clara replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm okay. I need to ask you something." There was a pause on the other end. "Of course, dear. What is it?" Clara hesitated, then decided to just go for it. "Do you know someone named Albert Wainwright?" The silence that followed was telling. Clara could almost hear her aunt's thoughts racing, searching for a way to respond. "Why do you ask?" Margaret's voice was cautious, guarded. "Because I found out he's my grandfather," Clara said bluntly. "He wrote me a letter. He's a patient at the hospital where I work." Another long pause, then a sigh. "Clara, we never told you because we thought it would be easier. Your parents didn't want him in your life. There were issues." Clara felt a pang of frustration. "What kind of issues? Why keep this from me?" "It's complicated," her aunt replied, her tone evasive. "Your mother and Albert had a falling out years before you were born. He was estranged from the family. When your parents passed away, we thought it best to keep things simple, to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Clara pressed, her voice rising. "From knowing the truth? From understanding my own family?" "Clara, please," her aunt said, her voice cracking slightly. "We did what we thought was right. We wanted you to have a stable upbringing, without any of the messiness that came before." Clara felt her anger simmering. "Well, I found out anyway. And now I'm standing here, next to the man who's supposedly my grandfather, and I don't know what to think." Margaret sighed again, a long, weary sound. "Maybe it's time you knew everything. But not over the phone. Come over for dinner. We'll talk." Clara agreed, though her frustration hadn't abated. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, feeling more confused than ever. Her aunt's reluctance to discuss the past only fueled her curiosity. What had happened between her parents and Mr. Wainwright? What was the messiness her aunt had mentioned? She looked at Mr. Wainwright, who lay as still as ever. Whatever the truth was, it felt like it was just out of reach, locked away in the mind of a man who might never wake up. Clara leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her head in her hands. "Why now?" she murmured. "Why tell me all this now?" The room remained silent, offering no answers. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, a mix of frustration and sadness welling up inside her. She had always felt a disconnect from her past, a sense that something vital was missing. And now, she was being offered a chance to uncover it, but it felt more like an unraveling than a revelation. After a few moments, she wiped her eyes and stood up. There was no use in lingering here, not when there were so many unanswered questions. She needed to know more, and dinner with her aunt seemed like the first step, however reluctant Margaret seemed. Clara looked down at Mr. Wainwright one last time, feeling a strange mix of emotions, curiosity, anger, and a flicker of compassion. "I'll be back," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was saying it for his benefit or her own. She turned and left the room, the door closing with a soft click behind her. As she walked out of the hospital and into the bright morning sunlight, Clara felt a sense of determination settle over her. She was going to get to the bottom of this, no matter how long it took. The truth was out there, tangled in the web of her family's past, and she was ready to untangle it, thread by thread. Clara felt a knot in her stomach as she approached her aunt's house. The familiar sight of the modest, two-story home brought back a flood of childhood memories, but today, the place felt different, like a stage set for a play she hadn't rehearsed for. She parked her car and sat for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The conversation with her aunt was bound to be challenging, but Clara was determined to get answers. She stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under her feet, and walked up the pathway lined with blooming hydrangeas. As she reached the front door, it swung open, revealing her Aunt Margaret, a warm but slightly strained smile on her face. "Clara, dear." "It's so good to see you," Margaret said, pulling her into a hug that felt a bit too tight. "Hi, Aunt Margaret," Clara replied, trying to match her tone. She could sense the undercurrent of tension, the unspoken truths that hung in the air between them. Margaret led Clara inside, where the familiar scent of roasted chicken filled the air. The dining table was set with the good china, a gesture Clara recognized as both welcoming and serious. Her Uncle David was already seated, looking up from the evening paper with a smile. "Clara! It's been too long," he said, rising to give her a hug. "How have you been?" "Good, Uncle David," Clara responded, feeling the awkwardness of small talk in a moment that felt anything but small. She took a seat, glancing around at the home that had been her refuge after her parents' death. Everything seemed so normal, yet now felt tainted by the weight of secrets. They exchanged pleasantries over dinner, discussing Clara's work at the hospital and her aunt and uncle's recent vacation. It was all so mundane, yet Clara felt like she was watching from a distance, waiting for the real conversation to begin. Finally, as the meal wound down and the plates were cleared, Margaret looked at Clara, her expression serious. "Clara, about Albert," she began, hesitating slightly. "We should have told you about him earlier. We thought it would be easier if you didn't know. Less confusing." Clara leaned forward, her gaze intense. "I need to know the truth, Aunt Margaret. What happened? Why didn't you tell me about him? What issues were you talking about?" Margaret sighed, glancing at David, who nodded encouragingly. She turned back to Clara, her eyes softening with a mixture of sadness and regret. "Your mother, Lily, and Albert had a complicated relationship," Margaret started, choosing her words carefully. "Albert was a good man, but he had his faults. He was difficult. Very set in his ways. When Lily married your father, Richard, Albert disapproved. He didn't think Richard was good enough for her, and that caused a lot of tension." Clara listened intently, her heart aching at the thought of her parents' past. Margaret continued, her voice steady. "There were arguments, hurtful words exchanged. It got to the point where Lily decided to cut ties with him. She felt it was best for her and for you, especially after you were born. They didn't want that kind of negativity in your life." Clara nodded, absorbing the information. "But why keep it from me? Why not tell me about him after they were gone?" Margaret reached across the table, taking Clara's hand. "We thought we were protecting you, dear. After the accident, you were so young, and we didn't want to burden you with more loss or complicated family issues. We hoped that by keeping things simple, you could grow up without that shadow hanging over you." Clara felt a mix of emotions, frustration, empathy, confusion. "But he wrote to me. He said he wanted to see me, to explain things. Why now, after all this time?" David chimed in, his voice gentle. "Albert must feel that time is running out. Maybe he regrets how things ended. People often seek reconciliation when they face their own mortality." Clara thought about this, her mind racing. The image of Mr. Wainwright lying in the hospital, comatose and fragile, filled her thoughts. What if he never woke up? What if she never got the chance to hear his side of the story? "Do you know anything else about my parents? Anything they never told me?" Clara asked, her voice almost pleading. Margaret sighed, looking pensive. "They were good people, Clara. They loved you very much. They wanted to shield you from the difficult parts of life. Maybe too much." Clara felt a lump in her throat, tears threatening to spill over. "I wish I could remember them more clearly," she whispered, her voice breaking. "All I have are fragments, like pieces of a puzzle that don't fit together." Margaret squeezed her hand. We all have pieces missing, Clara. But you can still find the edges, connect the parts that make sense. After a moment of silence, Clara stood up, feeling the weight of the evening pressing down on her. Thank you, Aunt Margaret, Uncle David. For everything. But I think I need to find out the rest on my own. Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. Of course, dear. Just know that we're here for you, whatever you find. Clara hugged them both, feeling a bittersweet mix of love and loss. As she left the house, the night air felt cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth inside. She walked to her car, pausing to look back at the house. It felt like she was leaving behind not just a place, but a chapter of her life. As she drove away, Clara's thoughts drifted to Mr. Wainwright again. There was so much she didn't know, so much she needed to uncover. The truth felt like a distant shore, shrouded in mist, but she was determined to reach it. The pieces of her past were scattered, but she was ready to start putting them together, one by one. And as she navigated the quiet streets, Clara felt a newfound resolve. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. For herself, for her parents, and for the man who had waited so long to tell her his story. The puzzle was incomplete, but she was ready to find the missing pieces, no matter how difficult the journey. The following morning, Clara woke with a sense of determination. She had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The revelations from her aunt and uncle had only deepened her resolve to uncover the truth about her family. Today, she planned to visit Mr. Wainwright's home, a place she hoped held more pieces to the puzzle of her past. After a quick breakfast, Clara dressed in comfortable clothes and set out. The address she had found in the hospital records led her to a quaint, old-fashioned neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The houses here had a timeless charm, with well-tended gardens and tree-lined streets that whispered of a quieter, bygone era. As Clara pulled up to the address, she felt a pang of nerves. The house was a modest two-story structure with white siding and blue shutters. It looked like it had been lovingly maintained, yet there was a sense of solitude about it, as if it had been waiting for something, or someone. Clara stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath her feet. She approached the front door, hesitating for a moment before knocking. The sound echoed in the quiet, and she waited, feeling a bit like an intruder in this unknown part of her life. After a few moments, an older woman opened the door. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a warm, but curious expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes scanning Clara with a hint of recognition. "Hi, I'm Clara Stevens," Clara began, offering a small smile. "I work at the hospital where Mr. Wainwright is a patient. He left me a letter, and I think he might be my grandfather." The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she stepped back, gesturing for Clara to enter. "Oh, dear. Please come in. I'm Helen, the housekeeper. I've worked for Mr. Wainwright for many years." Clara nodded, stepping inside. The interior of the house was cozy and inviting, filled with antique furniture and family photos. It felt like stepping into a different time, a place where memories were carefully preserved. Helen led Clara to a sitting room and offered her a seat. "I wasn't aware Mr. Wainwright had any living family," Helen said, settling into a chair across from Clara. "He never spoke much about his past." Clara glanced around the room, her eyes catching on a photograph of a younger Mr. Wainwright standing beside a woman and a young girl. The woman had dark hair and kind eyes, the girl a bright smile. Clara felt a pang in her chest, wondering if that was her mother. "He wrote me a letter," Clara explained, pulling it from her bag. "He said he was my grandfather, that my parents were his children. I didn't know until now." Helen sighed, a sympathetic look crossing her face. "That sounds like Albert. He was always a private man, kept his emotions close. I knew he had a daughter, Lily, and that there was some kind of estrangement. But he never spoke about it in detail." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of those unspoken words. "Do you know anything about my parents? What happened between them and Mr. Wainwright?" Helen hesitated, then nodded. From what little I gathered, there was a lot of tension. Mr. Wainwright had strong opinions, and when Lily married your father, Richard, he didn't approve. He thought Richard wasn't good enough, that he wouldn't be able to provide the life he wanted for Lily. Clara felt a familiar knot of frustration. But why hold on to that grudge? Why not make peace? Helen shook her head sadly. Albert could be stubborn, set in his ways. But deep down, I think he regretted it. Especially after the accident. Clara's heart ached at the mention of the accident. It had always been a shadowy part of her past, something her aunt and uncle had never fully explained. What happened? How did they die? Helen looked down, her voice soft. It was a car accident. A drunk driver hit them. It was sudden, tragic. Albert was devastated. He blamed himself for not being there, for not mending things with them while he had the chance. Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. The image of her parents, the life they could have had, flashed before her. He never tried to contact me, she said, her voice choked. Why now? Helen sighed, reaching out to squeeze Clara's hand. Maybe he's finally ready to face the past. To make amends, if he can. Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. Do you think he kept anything from that time? Letters, photos, anything? Helen stood up, gesturing for Clara to follow. Come with me. There's something I think you should see. They walked through the house to a small study. Helen opened a drawer and pulled out a dusty box, setting it on the desk. Clara felt her heart race as Helen opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and a few personal items. Clara sifted through the contents, her eyes landing on a photograph of a young woman holding a baby, her mother, Lily, holding her. The realization hit her like a wave, the faces in the photograph suddenly so familiar and yet so foreign. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she picked up the photograph, her fingers tracing the image. That's my mom, she whispered, her voice breaking. And that's me. Helen watched quietly, giving Clara a moment to process. Clara continued to look through the box, finding more photographs of her parents, letters her mother had written to Mr. Wainwright, and small keepsakes that spoke of a life she had never known. As Clara read through a letter her mother had written, she felt a deep connection to the woman she barely remembered. The letter spoke of love, hope, and regret for the rift between her and her father, and hope that one day they could reconcile. Clara looked up at Helen, her voice filled with determination. I need to talk to him, to Mr. Wainwright. If he wakes up, I need to hear his side, to understand why things happened the way they did. Helen nodded, her expression soft with understanding. Of course, dear. I hope you get that chance. Clara gathered the photographs and letters, carefully placing them back in the box. She felt a mix of emotions, grief for the family she had lost, anger at the years of silence and secrets, and a fragile hope for the future. As she left the house, the weight of her discoveries settled on her shoulders, heavy yet strangely liberating. She drove back to the hospital, the box of memories beside her. Her mind was a whirl of thoughts, but one thing was clear, she needed to understand her family's past to move forward. And if Mr. Wainwright woke up, she would be there, ready to listen, ready to piece together the story of a family fractured by pride and regret, but bound by love. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Clara felt she was on the right path. The past was slowly coming into focus, and with it, the possibility of healing and understanding. The road ahead was uncertain, but Clara was ready to face it, one step at a time. The days following Clara's visit to Mr. Wainwright's home were a blur of emotions and introspection. She spent hours poring over the photographs and letters she had found, piecing together the fragments of a family history that had been hidden from her for so long. Each new discovery felt like a revelation, bringing her closer to understanding the complex web of love, pain, and missed opportunities that had shaped her life. As she sat in her apartment, surrounded by the artifacts of her parents' and grandparents' lives, Clara felt a profound sense of connection to the people she had never truly known. The letters from her mother, filled with love and longing, spoke to a deep desire for reconciliation that had gone unfulfilled. The photographs captured moments of joy and sorrow, glimpses of a life that could have been hers if circumstances had been different. Yet, amidst the sorrow and regret, Clara felt a growing sense of peace. She realized that, despite the years of silence and separation, her family had always been connected by an invisible thread of love. The mistakes and misunderstandings, the pride and stubbornness, they were all part of the human experience, part of the legacy she carried within her. Clara's thoughts often wandered back to Mr. Wainwright, still lying in his hospital bed, silent and unmoving. She wondered if he would ever wake up, if she would ever have the chance to speak with him, to ask him the questions that burned in her heart. The doctors had said his condition was stable but uncertain. All she could do was wait and hope. One evening, as Clara sat by his bedside, reading one of her mother's letters aloud, she noticed a flicker of movement. She looked up, heart pounding, and saw Mr. Wainwright's fingers twitch. Her breath caught in her throat, and she leaned closer, holding her breath. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open, squinting against the harsh hospital lights. "Mr. Wainwright?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" He blinked, his eyes focusing on her face. For a moment, there was confusion, then recognition. A tear slid down his cheek as he tried to speak, his voice a faint whisper. "Clara, is that you?" Clara nodded, tears streaming down her own face. "Yes, it's me. I'm here." He reached out a trembling hand, and Clara took it, feeling the frailness of his grip. There was so much she wanted to say, so many questions she needed to ask, but in that moment, words seemed inadequate. Instead, she sat quietly, holding his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, the reality of his presence. After a few minutes, Mr. Wainwright cleared his throat, his voice still weak but steadier. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'm so sorry for everything." Clara shook her head, squeezing his hand. "It's okay. I just want to understand." Over the next few days, as Mr. Wainwright regained his strength, Clara visited him daily. They talked about the past, about her parents, and about the choices that had led to their estrangement. Mr. Wainwright spoke of his regrets, his pride, and his deep sorrow at having lost so many years with his family. "I was a fool," he admitted one day, his voice choked with emotion. "I let my pride blind me. I lost my daughter, my son-in-law, and nearly lost you too. I just wanted the best for her, for all of you, but I went about it the wrong way." Clara listened, her heart aching for the man who had lived with so much pain and regret. "We all make mistakes," she said gently. "But we can still find a way forward." As they talked, Clara felt a sense of healing begin to take root. The conversations were not easy, they were filled with raw emotions and difficult truths. But through it all, Clara sensed a deepening bond forming between them, a bond that transcended the years of silence and separation. In the weeks that followed, Clara and Mr. Wainwright worked together to piece together the remaining fragments of their family's story. They visited the places her parents had lived, met with old family friends, and even reconnected with some distant relatives. Each encounter brought new insights, new stories, and new opportunities for healing. One day, they visited a small lakeside park where her parents had often taken her as a child. Clara had only the faintest memories of the place, but as they walked along the shore, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if she were walking in the footsteps of her past. They sat on a bench, watching the gentle ripples on the water. Mr. Wainwright turned to Clara, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "Clara, I can't change the past," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I want you to know that I love you. I loved your parents, even if I didn't always show it the right way. I want to be a part of your life, if you'll have me." Clara felt tears welling up again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and love. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'd like that," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "I'd like that very much." As they sat there, watching the sun set over the lake, Clara felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The journey to this moment had been long and difficult, filled with uncertainty and pain. But it had also been a journey of discovery, of healing, and of finding a new sense of belonging. In the end, Clara realized that the truth was not just about uncovering the facts of her family's past. It was about understanding the complexities of love, forgiveness, and the human experience. It was about finding the courage to face the past, to embrace the present, and to look forward to the future with hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the water, Clara and Mr. Wainwright sat in companionable silence. The air was cool, the world hushed, as if holding its breath in anticipation of the new day that would dawn. In that quiet moment, Clara felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by a lightness, a sense of possibility. She looked at Mr. Wainwright, her grandfather, and saw not just a man burdened by regrets, but a person capable of love and redemption. Together, they had faced the shadows of the past and emerged into the light. The future stretched out before them, unknown and unwritten, but filled with promise. Clara knew that there would still be challenges ahead, but she also knew that she would not face them alone. As they stood to leave, Clara took one last look at the lake, the water now a deep shade of blue, mirroring the sky above. She felt a deep sense of gratitude, for the journey, for the answers she had found, and for the new beginning that awaited her and her grandfather. They walked back to the car, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future held. The road ahead was clear, and for the first time in a long time, Clara felt truly at peace. She smiled at Mr. Wainwright, and he smiled back, his eyes filled with warmth and love. Together, they drove home, leaving the past behind but carrying its lessons forward, ready to write the next chapter of their story, a story of reconciliation, hope, and the enduring power of family.